Hey everyone, how's it going? Forrest here, again with another installment of my complete analysis of all of Bach's chorale harmonizations. Today we're looking at Befiehl, deine, Wege, which translates to entrust your way. This is a pretty interesting chorale. It has some unique harmonic tidbits throughout, but for all intents and purposes, it's relatively straightforward. We're just going to hop right into the analysis. So there are two sharps in the key signature. We start on B minor, we end on F sharp major, so I would reckon that the entire tonality of the chorale is B minor, but I do believe we start in the key of D major. There is an argument to be made that the entire first phrase is in the key of B minor, but I feel like the opening section is just too undeniably D major-like to ignore it and just stay in B minor for the sake of convenience, but we do modulate to B minor by the time we arrive at our cadence, which is a half cadence. More specifically, it's a Phrygian half cadence. Phrygian, yes, I could spell it. So instead of starting on a 1 chord, we're actually starting on a 6 chord with a passing 7th in the bass. We then have G, B, D, and B, that is G major in root position, so immediately starting with a thirds progression. That's kind of interesting, 6 going to 4, not the most common progression out there, but we do have some passing tones in the inner voices here, leaving us with G, C sharp, E, and B. That's C sharp minor 7 flat 5 over G, which would be a 7, 4, 3 chord. Passing here, 4 going to 7 being probably the most common subdivided chord progression in all of the chorales, at least what I've seen so far. And then we go to D major, F sharp, D, F sharp, and A, which is our tonic triad in root position. We then have E, B, D, and, E, D, B, and G. I do believe that the tenor is singing higher than the alto. Yeah, the tenor is singing higher than the alto here, which is interesting. But I do think this D right here is a 7/6 suspension over the bass, and coincidentally this B might also be a chord tone, but I'm going to mark it as an accented non-chord tone. And what we're actually dealing with here is E, C sharp, and G. That's really fascinating. He doubles the leading tone. That's pretty interesting. He typically avoids that. But this is C sharp diminished over E, which is a 7/6 chord, much more common chord progression that we would expect to see in the chorales. But the interesting thing about this progression here is that if you've watched my videos in the past, you will know that 1/6-7/6 will ultimately lead to a tonic triad here on the other side. But that's not what we get. We get another sort of suspension figure here with another 7/6 suspension over the bass. And then we get B. So we get faked out, and this is actually a deceptive progression of sorts, 7/6 going to 6/6 rather than 1 in root position. So we have all of the hallmarks of the progression, but instead of D here in the tenor, we have B. So the chords are similar. The voices are resolving the way that we would expect them to for the most part, but this is a deceptive take on that progression, which is really fascinating. We don't see these all too often. I'm not sure if we've ever seen one at all. We probably have. It's so uncommon that it doesn't really trigger a memory. But I do think that this is the point in which we modulate to the key of B minor. This is now our tonic in the key of B minor, and as we are preparing for our cadence, we have G, B, D, and E. That is E minor 7 over G, which would be a 4/6/5 chord. Pretty interesting. Neighbor tone here in the tenor before we get G, B, C, and E. I think this C is an accented non-chord tone, and it's this B that's actually our chord tone here. This is a C sharp, sorry, not a C natural. And all this is doing is taking the chord, getting rid of the 7th, and still keeping it in second inversion. So I'll just change the figure bass to reflect that. And then of course we cadence on our 5 chord, this being a half cadence after all, F sharp, A, C sharp, and F sharp, A sharp, C sharp, and F sharp, our 5 chord. Interesting that this half cadence does not have the 5th of the chord in the melody. Not that that is a rule or anything, but most half cadences in Bach have the 5th of the chord in the melody. And as we look towards the second phrase of the A section, we have a perfect authentic cadence in the key of B minor, so no modulations here. This phrase is much plainer in terms of the chords that occur. We start off with F sharp major again, F sharp, A sharp, F sharp, and C sharp. No need to reanalyze. And then we immediately go to B minor, B, B, F sharp, and D tonic triad, passing 7th in the bass, D, B, F sharp, and D. That's another B minor triad. This time it's in first inversion. We don't need to reiterate the Roman numeral, but we'll change the figured bass. Passing tone in the bass as well. And then we get F sharp, B, F sharp, and C sharp. I guess you could make an argument that this is a B minor triad over F sharp, but I think actually this B is an accented non-chord tone. It's or rather a suspension, a 4/3 suspension over the bass, implying that this would be a 5 chord. And this is a pretty common thing that Bach does when we have this neighbor tone here that echoes the suspension in the cadence here, and this could be really in any of the voices. But this B is also a non-chord tone, and then we get the resolution here on the next beat. F sharp, A sharp, F sharp, and C sharp. So we don't need to reanalyze because the chord's being implied on the previous beat. Delayed passing 7th here in the alto, and then we cadence on B minor, B, F sharp, D, and B. Perfect authentic cadence. Looking ahead, we have a Plagal Cadence. Sorry, I have to move something off frame here so I could write. Plagal Cadence, very unusual, especially this C natural. What's going on here? We'll get to it. We start off with B minor, B, B, F sharp, and D. No need to reanalyze because it's still a tonic triad, but in the key of D major, this is our 6th chord, and I'm pretty convinced that we have something similar going on to the beginning of our chorale here. Passing 7th in the tenor, E, G, E, and C sharp. This would be C sharp diminished over E, which would be a 7/6 chord, similar to this progression that we saw here. This B is a passing tone. I suppose you could make the argument that this is a 2 chord, or like a 2 chord in root position. You could also make the argument that this is, a 2/7 chord, if that's the way that you look at it. But I think that it makes much more sense based on the contexts that we've seen 7 chords appear in the chorales to call it a 7 chord. It's more consistent with the way that I've done analysis. But if you're more of a literalist and just looking at what's on the beat of the harmonic rhythm, 2, I think would be probably just as valid of an analysis, if not the analysis to go for. I just think functionally speaking, the 7 makes more sense because it's a dominant functioning chord that precedes a tonic. F sharp, A, E, and A, but this E is a 7/6 suspension over the bass, which would just be a 1/6 chord in the key of D major. Next beat, we have G, G, D, and B, which is G major in root position. That is our 4 chord. Sorry for the typo here. I was really wondering what was going on with this chord. This was a C in the score, but it was just a typo that was made. It's actually a D, which makes a lot more sense. If this were a C, we'd have some weird G sus chord. And I was like, this is going to be a really interesting talking point. But no, typically speaking, if it's an interesting talking point to the extent that the chord is, some type of accented sus chord with no prepared suspension or anything like that, it's usually a typo. And it sort of indicates to me that I need to go back and check for another edition to corroborate whether or not that's the actual note. But after our 4 chord, we go to, this B is a chord tone as well, so we don't need to mark it. After our chord tone here, after our 4 chord, we have F sharp, E, G, and C sharp. I reckon this F sharp's an accented non-chord tone, and this is actually E, G, G, and C sharp, which is C sharp diminished over E, 7/6. 4 going to 7 is a very good sign. And then instead of getting a tonic triad here, D major is the foundation of this chord, we get C natural, which tells me that there is something going on here with this chord that's beyond a tonic function. This would be a D7 chord over or not necessarily a D7 chord, but a D chord over F sharp, but I think this C natural is changing the function, so this would be some type of 5/6 chord of 4, because of the fact that this C natural is hinting at the fact that we're thinking in terms of G major for these 2 beats, and that's exactly where it resolves: G, B, G, and D. Definitely has an unusual sound to it. We know from earlier that G major is our 4 chord. Let me go ahead and rewrite that so that looks less like an uppercase 2 and more like an uppercase 4. And then we cadence on D major, D, A, F sharp, and D, which is our tonic triad root position, making this a Plagal cadence like I mentioned earlier. Next phrase, we're looking ahead towards a half cadence in the key of E minor, so we're looking for a point to modulate. We start the phrase off with D major, D, D, F sharp, and A. We don't need to reanalyze because that is still a tonic triad. We also have a passing seventh here in the tenor, and then we go to E minor, E, B, F sharp, and B, but of course, sorry, G, B, F sharp, and B. So this would be E minor in first inversion. This F sharp being a 7/6 suspension over the bass. In the key of D major, this would be a 2/6 chord, but in the key of E minor, this would be a 1/6 chord. I think this is where we modulate, especially because we get D sharp on the next beat as well as C natural, so this seems like a logical place to analyze the modulation. F sharp, C natural, E, and A is F sharp minor 7 flat 5, which is a 2/7 chord. In the key of E minor, this B is an anticipation, this D sharp is a neighbor tone, but in kind of a similar fashion to this 4/7 progression earlier, where we had two inner voices, or we had the inner voices turn the 4 chord into a dominant functioning chord before we resolve to a tonic. That's exactly what's happening here. F sharp, B, D sharp, and A is B7 over F sharp, which is a 5/4/3 chord. Coincidentally, we have another second inversion 7 chord here, which is pretty interesting. Mostly a coincidence, I imagine, because the inner voices are doing it and the outer voices are static. The inner voices are the ones that are making the chord change, so the outer voices are dictating the inversion. And then we get E minor, E, B, E, and G, which is our tonic triad in root position. After our tonic triad, this G is a chord tone, so we don't need to mark it. This F sharp is a neighbor tone. And then we have F sharp, B, E, and G. I think this F sharp is an accented non-chord tone, and we're actually dealing with E, B, E, and G here, which is another tonic triad, so we don't need to reanalyze. And then we cadence on 5, B, B, D sharp, and F sharp, which is B major. Our next phrase begins in the key of A major. It's a direct modulation because we have this juxtaposition of the key of E minor being the focus of the previous phrase, starting off with an E major chord, or at least a fundamentally E major chord. This is E7 over G sharp, B, E, and D. So I do believe this is a direct modulation, and that would make this a 5/6/5 chord. And of course, we would expect that to go to 1, A, E, and C sharp, which is our tonic triad. Passing tones in the outer voices, and then we get C sharp, A, E, and E, which is another tonic triad, but it's in first inversion. This G sharp is a non-chord tone. It's a 7th, kind of like a delayed neighbor tone. We then get F sharp, A, F sharp, and D. It's D major over F sharp, which is 4/6. Then we get G sharp, B, and E here, and when combined with that D, we get a subdivided 5/6/5 here, 4/6 to 5/6/5. That's a normative chord progression. That's good. We would expect that to go to 1, which it does. A, C sharp, E, and C sharp, our tonic triad. Again with another chordal 7th, but it's a non-chord tone in this context. Moving towards our cadence, we have D, D, F sharp, and B, which is our 2/6 chord, B minor over D. We know that Bach loves 2/6 chords, especially in cadential situations. This B is a chord tone, so we don't need to mark it. We then have E, G sharp, E, and B, which is our 5 chord, E major, and then we cadence in an imperfect authentic cadence here on A major, A, E, and C sharp. Fairly straightforward cadence here. Unlike the next phrase, which has a very unusual cadence, we end on a half cadence, which is already on the unusual side, but the chords that we get moving in to the key of B minor at the end are particularly unusual. So the phrase starts off in the key of D major. This A major chord turns into our 5 in the key of D major, as Bach often does when he cadences in the key of the dominant, just ends up turning into 5. It's like a glorified half cadence in some cases. And then we go to 1, D, A, D, and F sharp, our tonic triad. We have a passing 7th in the bass here, and then we get B, B, D, and G, which is G major over B. That's a 4/6 chord. And when we have this 4/6 chord moving to a tonic triad, D, A, D, and F sharp, we always have a leading tone or a scalar 7th, like the leading tone or the subtonic 7th connecting the 6th and the root of the scale. We then have D, A, E, and E. I do think this D is a lower suspension, could be like a 5/6 suspension. It's actually probably like what would it be, a 9/10 suspension under the alto and the melody, because those notes are doubled. But this would be A major over C sharp, which is 5/6. And similar to what we saw earlier here, where we saw our tonic triad repeated over the course of 2 beats, we're going to get the same thing happening here. We have B, C sharp, E, and A, but this B is an accented non-chord tone. It's actually this C sharp that is our chord tone here, making this a 5/6/5 chord. And I do believe that this is where we modulate to the key of B minor. After all, we don't really have too much room until it looks like we are in the key of B minor with A sharp and G sharp happening. So this A actually turns into 7/6 in the key of B minor. We have seen Bach modulate over subtonic sevenths in the past. It is relatively uncommon though, but I do think it makes sense in this case because of what happens here on this downbeat. Very interesting. We have D and we have F sharp, but the inner voices are E and C sharp. If we look at the greater context of what's happening here, it looks like this E is functioning as a suspension as well as this C sharp. The C sharp wants to resolve down to B. This A sharp is just an enclosure, it's just surrounding the B, and this E pretty plainly goes down to D. So if we take a look at what's happening on the next beat, we have B, B, D, and F sharp, which would be our tonic triad. So what I think is being implied here is a 1/6 chord, despite the fact that when you take this passing C sharp here, as well as this A sharp, which is not a chord tone in the context of B minor, we have C sharp, A sharp, E, and F sharp, which is F sharp 7 over C sharp. That would be a 5/4/3 chord. And Bach does a series of just oscillating between 1 and 5 and 1 here, B, B, D, and F sharp, another tonic triad there. And this G sharp functions very similarly to this A sharp here, where it's enclosing the A sharp on our final cadential chord, F sharp major, F sharp, A sharp, C sharp, and F sharp, which, as we already know, is our 5 chord. And that is today's analysis. This double suspension here definitely being the hallmark of this chorale, as well as this interesting Plagal cadence. Let's not neglect that, because 7/6 going to 5/6/4 is really, for all intents and purposes, the same thing as 7 going to 1. But because of the C natural here, we really are fusing the idea of G major and D major at the same time, and that's really the power of flatting that 7th scale degree. But other than that, relatively straightforward. Tomorrow's chorale is actually very similar to this one, so I'm looking forward to comparing and contrasting how the chorales are with one another. And that's pretty much all I have to say about today's chorale. If you're interested in following me along on the journey to analyze all of the chorale harmonizations, feel free to subscribe to the channel. You could also hit the notification icon if you're interested in being notified about my daily upload. And you could also like the video if you enjoyed the content. It means that more people are going to see the video. But on that note, thank you so much for watching the video and supporting the channel by doing so. I look forward to tomorrow's analysis, and I hope you take care.